Good morning from Brazil, but also I guess good afternoon and good evening since we are in different time zones. I'd like to welcome you all to this USRN webinar about the Times Higher Education Impact Ranks. My name is Valmor Tricoli. I'm the Provost for International Cooperation at the University of São Paulo, Brazil. And I apologize beforehand if I pronounce your name in a fun way. So feel free to correct me if I say your name, as I said, in a funny way. First of all, let me introduce our special guests for today. We're very pleased to have Mr. Duncan Ross and Professor Julian Skyrme. Is that right?
Dr. Julian Skyrme, I'll take that.
Okay, perfect. Okay. Mr. Duncan Ross is the Chief Data Officer at the Times Higher Education, and he is responsible for the analysis and interpretation of data about higher education institutions, and ultimately the ranks. Dr. Julian Skyrme is the Director of Social Responsibility at the University of Manchester. The University of Manchester is the top higher education institute in the UK in the 2020 impact ranks, and number 8 overall globally. Also, Dr. Skyrme has worked in higher education since 2001 in a range of leadership and management positions. I guess it's unnecessary to say that the Times Higher Education launched the University Impact Ranks in 2019. And the idea behind the rankings is to measure how universities are performing against the United Nations SDGs. And this webinar is an opportunity for all of us to understand better the impact rankings. I'm not a big fan of formalities. I'm not wearing a tie or a jacket, but we have defined a structure for today. This webinar will run for a maximum of 90 minutes, and we are going to start with Mr. Duncan Ross' presentation, around a 30 minutes presentation about the methodologies, the purpose of the THE impact rankings. After that, we are going to around a 50 minutes presentation. Dr. Julian is going to share the experiences of the University of Manchester. And after that, we are going to have a Q&A session and discussion around 30 minutes or so, and 5 or 10 minutes for the final comments from our guests. Enough talking. We should start our webinar with the presentation of Mr. Duncan. Mr. Duncan, please, you have the floor. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that introduction, and thank you to the network for inviting me along to speak. My name's Duncan Ross. I'm Chief Data Officer for Times Higher Education. So I've been responsible both for designing these particular rankings, but also for the data collection and trying to understand what they're telling us about what universities are doing. So very briefly, Times Higher Education has been involved in the higher education network globally since 1971. And from my perspective, what we've been trying to do since 2015 is use data to better understand how universities are behaving, what they're doing, what their focuses are. And one of the key ways we do that is by gathering data through our various rankings. The oldest of those, the World University Rankings, started off in 2004 and is very much focused around what we would describe as research-intensive universities. To even participate in that ranking, you need to have published at least 1,000 academic publications over a 5-year period. More recently, we've started to explore the teaching mission. It's a very different mission, much harder to evaluate that on an international basis. But then about 3 years ago, we started to try and explore what was meant by impact. And we started off doing some initial data collection around innovation. And to be totally blunt, that was not very successful. But we started to dig a little deeper, and at about that time, we decided that actually there was already a very strong existing framework in the world which would allow us to explore impact. And that, of course, is the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. Now, that particularly appealed to us because it did have key elements around innovation in, but it also looked at a much broader range of measures, including, and this is really important, measures which look at inequalities and how universities are really trying to change society. And I think that's one of the clear reasons why the Sustainable Development Goals themselves are directly relevant to the work that your network is doing. It talks about that bigger aspect of sustainability, not just the traditional green agenda, but also those aspects of development and, of course, about equity, which is crucial. But when you look at the Sustainable Development Goals, they're not designed for universities. There's a huge amount of documentation there, and because it's the United Nations, it's available in multiple languages. But they aren't designed for universities. I think universities are mentioned once explicitly and once implicitly in all of the documentation. And so one of the things we had to do was to understand how it was that a university could demonstrate the progress that they were taking towards delivering on the goals. And to do that, we built out this very straightforward theory of change. It has 4 key elements. The first of those is research. It's clear that the research that a university does, for example, if you're researching into battery technology, well, that can have a clear and direct impact around Sustainable Development Goal 7, Clean and Affordable Energy, and Sustainable Development Goal 13, Climate Action. So research is the first component. The second component is around stewardship, how universities look after their key resources, both the physical resources, your campuses, but also, of course, the human resources. How universities behave towards their staff, their employees, their students, and the people who work more broadly in the community is a crucial part of their role. The third aspect is outreach. Universities already do a huge amount of work in their communities, and that work isn't often reflected more broadly in university evaluation. And then finally, through teaching. Are you educating not just for the skills that are needed moving forwards, but also a broader understanding of what it means to be a human and to take sustainability into the future careers and lives of your alumni? So for each SDG, we went through and we tried to develop a set of metrics which would address those 4 key areas. For example, when we look at SDG 2, Zero Hunger, we have some measures of research. So we look at the research a university might be doing around the issues of hunger. We also look at aspects of stewardship, in this case, exploring student hunger. What actions is a university taking to make sure that no students are forced to withdraw from study because of either their or their family's hunger? We look at aspects of the work the university is doing in their community around addressing issues of hunger. And finally, we look at, in this case, the proportion of graduates you produce in agriculture, aquaculture, with an element of sustainability. So how are you teaching in a way that's going to support addressing SDG 2? So we've tried to do this for each of the 17 Sustainable Development Goals. And of course, for those of you who know the SDGs, there are the 17 SDGs themselves. The United Nations have built out 169 indicators and 223 unique targets. We've matched those SDGs 1 for 1. So we haven't tried to group those. There is an argument that says they should be grouped together into broad themes, but we decided that it wasn't appropriate for us to effectively impose a higher order upon those. Beneath those 17 SDGs, there are 105 metrics we measure and potentially up to 220 measurements. Now, clearly, that could impose a huge burden on universities in terms of data collection. I suspect Julian may mention this in his session after this. But we realized that that in itself could create a quite strong bias in the measurement. And so one of the decisions we took relatively early on was that we would try and simplify participation. And so as well as building out measures around each of the 17, we'd create an overall ranking. But to be in the overall ranking, we would require data for SDG 17, Partnership for the Goals. We think that's a sort of meta SDG. It talks about partnership, it talks about how you're cooperating, both with governments and NGOs and with other universities. But then you could choose any 3 other sustainable development goals. And so our hope was that that would minimize the burden to allow more universities to participate. I think if we hadn't done that, what we would be seeing is that the only universities who were able to fully participate would be global North universities who were relatively affluent, and that would fail to deliver on one of the key objectives of the Sustainable Development Goals themselves. Now, there's also a hypothesis I have, which is that universities in different parts of the world would have very different focuses, that they would flex the work they were doing to the issues that were most important to them. Why would a university in Sao Paulo have the same focus as a university in Manchester or a university in Malaysia? And we'll see later on whether my theory was correct. Obviously, we also had to think very carefully about the metrics that we chose, and we don't pretend for a moment that we've got this completely right. But we have tried to balance metrics to ensure that, at least in some respects, they address the needs of society rather than simply the affluence of society. And a good example of this would be around when we ask about first-generation students. If you come from a global North country where you have massified or universal higher education, it is harder to find students who are first-generation students than if you're in a country, for example, like Afghanistan or Iran or Iraq, where there are far more students who haven't had a family member who've attended university. And we hope that in some sense, we're trying to redress some of the imbalances that we see by some of the metrics we've chosen. So the first thing that I'm going to point out, and there are some elements here in red, which are about next year's ranking. The first thing to say here about changes is we are not changing that approach for next year. We will still maintain that SDG 17 plus 3 other SDGs. Now, I did mention that we create an overall score. We do this by taking SDG 17, and that's worth 22% of the overall ranking. And then the 3 SDGs that your university performs most strongly at. Clearly, if you supply data for all 17, then we have to choose the ones which you are strongest at, but you are free to submit far fewer. The way we've designed this is to try and ensure that bibliometrics, the research element, is consistent as a proportion across all of the, regardless of which SDGs you choose to submit. So how do we evaluate different aspects? Well, when we look at research, we work with our bibliometric partners, Elsevier, and they've produced effectively a keyword search. So for each SDG, they've tried to identify keywords which are associated with that particular SDG. And this forms a basket of publications from which we then take various measurements. So for example, around SDG 3, good health and well-being, we look at the number of downloads of papers because we want to see very directly, are people reading the publications around SDG 3? We also look at the number of citations in clinical guidance. So when does clinical guidance actually refer to your university's work? We also have another measure about the volume of publication as well. Now that keyword search continues to be developed, and there are mechanisms by which universities can participate in that. The easiest route is to go directly to Elsevier, but they've also provided an online resource which allows you to either comment on existing papers or to upload papers that you think may have been excluded from the keyword search. And it's worth saying that the nature of any keyword search is that you will create what I would describe as type 1 and type 2 errors, because I work in data, more commonly known as false positives and false negatives. Sometimes the search will include publications that should not be included because they're not about sustainable development, but it will include them by accident. Sometimes it will exclude some documents that should be included. And there's always going to be a balance there, but we hope with the ongoing participation of the higher education community, particularly those from outside the English-speaking world, that we can get better and better definitions of that over time. And those definitions, by the way, are open source. So You can take those, and even if you don't have a subscription to Elsevier, you should be able to run that query in other systems such as Web of Science or Microsoft Academic Graph or Google Scholar. It won't return exactly the same results, but it should give you a reasonably consistent data set. One of the other things we do, which is quite different in this ranking, is that we ask universities to provide evidence of work that they are undertaking. So rather than simply looking at the number of students you have, sometimes we ask you for case studies. Now, we don't do a full qualitative analysis. It will be very challenging for us to do that with over 800 universities submitting last year. And of course, we don't require these documents to be in English. If you're doing great work with your local community in Sao Paulo, we would expect that information to be in Portuguese, in Brazilian Portuguese. It would be crazy to ask you to produce it in English. So what we have done is built this lightweight framework for trying to produce a consistent assessment of that work. Firstly, we trust you, your universities, your seekers after truth. If you tell us you're doing something, we will give you credit for that, even if you provide no additional evidence. What we will then do, though, is if you have provided evidence, we will examine that, and we will try and make sure that that shows that you are doing what the question is asking about. If the evidence is public, so if it's published on a website, we then give additional credit. We do that for two reasons. Firstly, it gives us greater confidence that you're genuinely doing it, but much more importantly, it allows members of your community to hold you accountable. For example, in SDG 11, we ask about access to significant buildings, one of which we can see, for example, in the background of Julian. If you say that you're providing access to those buildings and your evidence is a timetable for when those buildings are open, members of the community can test that by going and knocking on your door, and if your doors aren't open, they will challenge you on that. Then we will also ask additional details. So we may ask about whether you work with local, national, regional government, and so on. We've tried to make the evidence evaluation this year much more consistent than it was last year by simplifying the number of different ways we ask the questions. And we've also published the methodology up front, and we've tried to be very explicit about how that is scored, again, to make this more obvious to participant universities. So here's an example from SDG 6, Clean Water and Sanitation. Here we're asking about how a university cooperates with local, national, or global governments on the issue of water security. We can see here that Hong Kong Baptist University have provided evidence around their work with their local government. But here's another example. This is what the University of Waterloo in Canada chose to submit. It's a link to a news article on their website, which is describing how they are working at the United Nations HLPF and how they were presenting specifically around water security. So it's a great piece of evidence. It's very public. It demonstrates clearly working on a transnational level on this particular issue. So how did the ranking last year work out? Well, the first thing to say is that 860 universities chose to participate, and over 770 submitted to SDG 17 plus 3 others, and so were included in the overall ranking. The top ranked university in the world was the University of Auckland from New Zealand. But one of the big questions I had was always going to be, are we just reflecting the usual suspects? Are the universities who come top of the impact ranking just Harvard, Oxford, Cambridge, etc.? Because I think if that was the case, we wouldn't have succeeded in one of our key objectives. But when I look at the top 100 composition from the impact ranking, compare that to the World University Ranking, which remember focuses on the research intensive universities, I see quite a different pattern emerging. Firstly, I see that there are far fewer North American institutions coming in the top 100. Of those 16, I would say a majority of those are actually from Canada rather than from the USA. We're seeing more universities from Asia getting into the top 100. Very positively, also one university from Africa and 3 universities from Latin America getting into the global top 100. And when we dig into individual SDGs, we see even more diversity. For example, when we look at SDG 6, we see universities from India performing very, very strongly on an issue that is clearly of significance to universities in India. And I did say I would reflect on this question of, are universities actually flexing what they're doing according to local need? Because it was a kind of hypothesis of mine. I would expect differences. It's not that the SDGs necessarily stand alone or that one SDG is more important than another. But if I was a university that was, again, I'll choose India. If I was a university in India, I would expect to focus my efforts around the things that were most significant and most immediately of concern to my local community. So did we see that? Well, firstly, here's the distribution of SDGs 1 through 16. Remember, universities could choose to submit or not, so I would expect to see a non-uniform distribution. And what can we pick out from this? Well, firstly, the most frequently submitted to SDGs were SDG 3, good health and well-being, and SDG 4, quality education. This shouldn't surprise us. Many universities have hospitals associated with them, and all of our medical students, all of our medics, we hope, go through the university process. That's part of their education. So it's no surprise we see SDG 3. SDG 4 is a little more interesting because although SDG 4 talks about quality education, a lot of the focus of this is actually around early years and around lifelong learning. And although universities can play significant roles in there, those aren't necessarily the focus of higher education. We then very positively see SDG 5, which is around gender equality, Sdg 9, innovation, infrastructure, and so on. So we see an interesting pattern emerging there. But I can use this as a, if you like, a benchmark, and I can compare different regions against this. And I'm going to pick on Europe first, because I think Europe tells us a very interesting story and gives me the first opportunity to apologize for the whole Brexit thing. I feel duty bound to do that and get that in early before someone asks the question about Brexit. And when we look at Europe, the line here, the midpoint says that we would see no difference in the distribution from European universities and the global distribution. Anything above that, more likely to submit, below that, less likely to submit. First thing I'll pull out, SDGs 1 and 2, no poverty and zero hunger. Far fewer universities in Europe are focusing on that. Probably not surprising, Europe is a relatively affluent part of the world. Hunger and poverty are things that, although they exist in Europe, seem to be less of an immediately pressing concern, and that's perhaps not a surprise. SDG 6, again, Julian, apologies for this. Europe is often viewed as a slightly wetter part of the world, particularly Manchester, as a slightly wetter part of the world than others. Water security, water issues are not something that are necessarily seen as such a pressing issue. On the other hand, what do we see as being more likely to be submitted to? SDG 8, decent work and economic growth, and SDG 16, peace, justice, and strong institutions. For those of you who are aware of the European project, those two SDGs pretty much talk to the Treaty of Rome and the foundational principles of the European Union. If we look at a different part of the world, if we look at Asia, in this case, East Asia, I've defined simply as India eastwards, we see a very different pattern of submission. SDG 1 and SDG 2, clearly much more important. SDG 6, driven by those Indian universities, very strong. But also SDG 9, industry, innovation, and infrastructure. Universities from Japan and South Korea leading very strongly on that SDG. So it is interesting that universities are flexing their response to the SDGs to reflect their local concerns. I think that's a really positive piece of feedback from this. But in my final few minutes, I'd just like to highlight a couple of changes from last year's methodology and a few key dates. We've tried to keep the methodology largely consistent. We don't want to change things unnecessarily, but we will change things for two reasons. Firstly, if we've got something badly wrong. If you look at a particular question and say that this makes no sense, or it doesn't make sense in our particular context, we want to hear that feedback, and we will adapt it. And we will be sensitive, particularly to concern from Global South universities. If you are concerned that we are misinterpreting the SDGs, please do talk to us about that, and we will change. The second reason we might change is because, frankly, people move on, and we think that everyone's answering yes to a particular question. And that would be a very positive reason to move on. If everyone says that, yes, they have a policy on gender pay equity, we'll stop asking about a policy and start asking harder questions about how you're implementing gender pay equity. So those are the reasons we'll try and change, but there have been some changes. Firstly, we have changed the entry criteria to make it clear that postgraduate only universities can submit data to it. So some of the wording has changed to reflect that. Hopefully previous calculation approaches should still be valid. The other change we've made in terms of participating is previously we'd said that universities need to be accredited. We've slightly backed off from that and we're using a definition of good standing. I don't think that will affect any university on this particular call, but it does allow us to say if a particular university has done something that is clearly against the principles of the Sustainable Development Goals, we will be able to take them out on that basis. But we are also asking universities to provide a little bit more data about what we're calling the university perimeter or boundary. Which parts of your university are you including in the data submission? This is especially relevant where you have complex university structures. For example, some of the United States state universities when they have multiple campuses. We're also producing some additional guidance. So we've put our guidance into the document again to try and make things more straightforward. Some internal work we've done around naming consistency. It turned out we, in some cases, had 4 different names for the same measurement. We've tried to be clear about that. And our methodology, we've tried to make that much more detailed, and we have published it in advance of the ranking process. Again, the portal, so the way that data is submitted, we've tried to make that much more usable this year. I hope that that will turn out to be the case. It's always a bit experimental. We hope we've made it more straightforward. And unfortunately for anyone from the United States, we are insisting on metric units this year only. Last year we had some interesting choice of units from our North American United States brethren who were measuring in gallons per cubic hectare or something strange. I'll never understand why they haven't changed the metric system yet. Key dates. Data collection opened on the 1st of October. So you can already submit data. Data collection we hope will close at the end of November. If that is challenging for you, please do talk to us about it. We expect many more universities to participate this year, which means we need more time to actually do that data validation and checking. We think that will take from December through to March. And the ranking will be launched on April the 23rd, possibly in person, but very likely it turns out remotely. If you have questions beyond those that I'm sure you'll be asking in this session, please do feel free to ask us. This isn't designed to be an exam. It's not about us putting the questions out there and then not talking to you. This is more like an assessment process. Please do talk to us through this. We want to hear back from you because every time a university approaches us and asks us a question about what we mean by a particular question, we can clarify this for so many more institutions, and it goes back into that positive feedback. So thank you very much for listening. Sorry that was a little bit of a lecture, even if one delivered remotely. I'm delighted to hand over to Julian, who can give you the other side of this story and explain how this worked out for him and where we got it wrong. So thanks very much for that. Look forward to hearing your questions.
Thank you, Duncan. Just a second. I believe we're going to have a lot of questions. Then I'm going to ask the attendees a little bit of patience and just wait for the Q&A session. Thanks for the very nice presentation, Duncan. And now, please, Dr. Julian, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Valmor, and thank you, Duncan, for a brilliant overview. And I didn't attempt to cover any of that. I've seen Duncan present this a few times now, and he's very comprehensive. So I'm not going to attempt to tell you any more about the what. I'm going to speak a little bit more about the why. Why did we get involved, first of all? And I'm going to give you 7 top tips I've learned from being involved for the past couple of years. We don't have all the answers at Menster, and this is about a dialogue, of course, but we've been involved since the outset and very much supported the development of this ranking. I will say I know some of the individuals on the Zoom today will have different ideas and philosophies about rankings as well. Is this ranking something that goes against the principles of the SDGs, which is about collaboration, for example? And I think these are all legitimate arguments. What I would say is we live in a world of rankings, and this one is trying to do something I believe really fits our mission, more so than some of the other rankings. And I speak from the perspective of a very privileged country, a very privileged university relatively in the global north. And I think this does even out some of those privileges, which is a really good thing. And it gets to the heart, I think, of what universities actually should all be about, which is improving the world. We produce and share knowledge. That's what we all do. We do research and we teach. But why do we do that? We don't just do that for any old reason. We do that to try and improve the world. And I think measuring that against what are the democratically agreed priorities for the world expressed through the UN SDGs, I can't think of any better way in which to judge what we're doing. If we are going to be judged against something external, I don't think there's anything better that we've got in the world that you could use instead. So if somebody does have a better idea, I'd love to hear it. But to me, this really does meet something very real. Just looking around the Zoom today and some of the participants, I think the majority of people haven't entered this ranking before. So I'm going to presume no knowledge. I know that one or two have, and I'm sorry if anything I say teaches you to suck eggs somewhat. And I'm really looking forward to the questions as well. And I'm going to show you some slides in a moment. Before I do that, I should say a little bit about my background, literally and metaphorically. So my literal background is the University of Manchester campus there. It's, I work in the UK's, I think we're the second largest university now because UCL have got larger. We were the biggest for many years, but certainly we have, we're a very large university by UK standards, not by University of Sao Paulo standards, but we have 40,000 students, around 12,000 staff, and our turnover is about £1,000 million, about £1 billion, which I forget what that would be in dollars, 1.3 billion, something like that a year. So it gives you an idea of the scale of our institution. We're very large. And my role, I'm the Director of Social Responsibility there. And I'll say a little bit about what social responsibility means to us and why that's relevant to taking part in this. So let me start my slides here. Just to check that you can all see that. Give me a thumbs up, Valmor, if that's all okay. There you go. Thank you for your thumbs. So I presume you can see my slides okay. So before I go into the ranking, we have a mission in the university, and we have a motto as well, a university motto. And like any good university motto in the UK, it's comprised of some Latin. So again, apologies to my Latin American colleagues on the call, but cognitio, knowledge, that's our research. Sapienta, which means wisdom. That's through our teaching, trying to teach our students to be wise, and humanitas, humanity. And those three facets to our motto, our university motto, is very much reflected in our university strategy. If I hover my mouse over there, I think you can see my cursor there, Valmor. Give me a thumbs up if you can see my cursor. Yeah, you can. So these are our three core goals here: research, teaching, and social responsibility. That makes us unique in British universities for having social responsibility as one of our core goals. And we've had this as a core goal since 2011. And we've been struggling, I think, to think, how can we measure our progress against this core goal of social responsibility? And that's where, when this ranking came along, we thought that was something really interesting, because it provides an external sense of, are we doing good work against this goal or not? So social responsibility is one of our core goals. For social responsibility, we have 4 priorities: social inclusion. This is an equality agenda about people. Better health, reflected perhaps by SDG 3 in particular. Cultural engagement, and environmental sustainability. There are 4 big priorities for social responsibility. When we try to judge ourselves as a university, we have 8 key measures overall in the university. So about whether our staff think we're a good place to work, whether we're in the top 5 in the UK for research, 90% of our students are satisfied, Europe's most innovative university. But this impact on society, we use a portfolio of measures to demonstrate our impact on society. And we have looked at the performance in the Times Higher Education Impact Rankings, and we've made that, being in the top 25, which certainly we have been in the first 2 years, our commitment to remaining in that top 25 is now one of our key performance indicators, and will continue to be, as well as a bunch of other things. There's a portfolio of things we're measuring. So, you know, is this a useful ranking? For us at Manchester, we think it is useful. It's one among a number of things we're looking at. All measures have their downsides, but we think it's suitably good to put into our own strategic plan moving forward in the next 5 years. I mentioned earlier that why are these SDGs important? If you're thinking about this as a university, why should you enter this ranking? To me, the main benefit of measuring yourselves against the Sustainable Development Goals is precisely because they're not written for universities. They're written for society more generally, of which universities are a key part. So rather than do typically what we do in universities is start from the inside out, and we think about faculties and schools and institutes, and we use all this language which nobody else frankly can understand if you don't work in a university. What's brilliant about the SDGs is it uses language which is common to the public sector, the private sector, the third sector, and educational institutions that exist in this third sector and state sector and public sector. It uses language which is common throughout the whole world, whether in the global north, the global south, whether you work in education or completely in a different sector. It gives you a common language. And I think if we believe that universities are there to reach out to society and to demonstrate our relevance to the rest of society, then these SDGs, I think, are part of the armory that we have to do that, because it gives us a common international language. And it opens doors, it opens conversations, it allows us to reach out and talk to people outside of universities. So for me, to have a ranking that relates to these SDGs, which are so universal in nature, is something that's a real gift, actually. Duncan talked about that from a THE perspective, they've thought about this theory of change and the different dimensions. When we started looking at the SDGs before we took part in the ranking, and we developed a model, it's not wildly different to what Duncan's is, but we talk about 4 dimensions to the SDGs: our research, our learning and students, our curriculum, our interest in being an engaging university that engages the public in the big issues of the day, and the fact we have operations. We need to buy stuff, we need to employ people, for example. So we use those 4 dimensions to think about how we contribute to each of the SDGs. And we started to map these things out. So we have lots going on the SDGs at Manchester, and if you Google SDGs and University of Manchester, you can read a bit more about what we do. We're very interested in engaging and involving our staff, our students, and our alumni. We do lots of research, obviously connected to the SDGs, as all of you do, and we involve our students. We think about our university operations. We've developed scholarships and bursaries linked specifically to the SDGs now. When we're engaging our alumni that exist in over 150 different countries around the world, we have a global day of action linked to the SDGs, and we're measuring obviously our performance in the SDGs as well. So we're doing a lot of work. And again, the rankings here, they shouldn't just be backwards looking, they should be something that should help set you goals moving forward as an institution. I'll say something about that later. We did, before we entered the ranking, we did our own internal annual report, if you like, on, well, impact report on the Sustainable Development Goals. And we've made a commitment to do this every 2 years. So we're in the process of doing our next one in this current academic year. And what we did is we took these 17 SDGs and we were very didactic about it. We did 2 pages on each, 2 sides on each. And we said that for each of those 17 goals, you can look at this in 4 ways, as I described earlier: our research, our students, our public engagement, and our operations. So think of a big grid where you've got the 17 SDGs, perhaps in the rows, and in the columns then you've got the 4 dimensions. We mapped out what we were doing, both quantitatively and qualitatively. And we did this report, and it was a really helpful way for us to start thinking about the different contributions we make, and really helped us with the rankings. So this is an excerpt from the report, just taking one SDG, SDG 11, and we gave some examples of research. We looked at some metrics. We looked at what we did on public engagement and students and operations. Now, for our next report, because we've now taken 2 years, we've got 2 years of data which we've entered into the Times Higher, we'll be able to use some of that data to make a more public, forward-looking report. So actually the two things will come together much more closely. This was done at the same time, just before actually that we were entered the ranking in 2018 for the first year for the 2019 ranking. We have a web page, as I mentioned, which I'd encourage you to have a look at. We have a really nice video that explains our approach as well to the SDGs. And just to give you an idea of interest from around other parts of society, when we do these impact reports in universities, which I'm sure lots of us do, they tend to be read just by other universities, if you're lucky. What we found with this report we did on the SDGs, if you look here, this is the number of times this report has been downloaded since it was published, and we have more than 6,000 downloads of our report on the SDGs, which colleagues tell me in my marketing team, this is phenomenal for such a report that a university does, looking at the impact of itself, which often isn't interesting to many people beyond the higher education sector. So there's a real appetite among other parts of society to think about these goals. In terms of performance, we've been looking at how we do in the UK. We're really interested, obviously we're a British university, so how do we do overall compared to other universities in our own country? And it's very easy to filter the data. If you enter this, this table, you can get all of this data very easily. So it's a really good way of looking at where you fit overall. You can look obviously at how you've performed overall in the world as well. So in the most recent ranking, we were really pleased. We came 8th in the world. We joined 3rd in the first year, but we knew more institutions were entering, and people would obviously improve what they did and develop what they did on the basis of previous experience. So we really hoped we would get in the top 10 again, and we did. We remained first overall in the UK, but a lot of British universities did quite well in this ranking as well. So we were really pleased with our performance. I don't think, though, that you should enter just because you think you're going to do really well. So we entered, I'll come back in my tips later, we entered all 17. Some of them we don't do as well in the world, as you'll see. Very open about this. That's why I want to share the data with you. That's just as important to understand. So even if you only do really well in one of them, you become top 10 in your country in one of them, it's worth knowing that, because if you don't enter, you don't know where you feature. So it gives you really good information. So you can choose whether to enter the minimum number, which, as Duncan said, is SDG 17 plus 3 others. That's all you have to do to enter. Or you can choose to enter them all or somewhere in between. Our approach is we might as well enter them all, because it doesn't cost anything to enter and you get lots of really good information back. But we know there are some areas that we do better than others at Manchester. So, call this 7 ways to heaven. If you've not entered before, what do I wish I knew, or what if I was listening to this and I hadn't entered, what would I want to know that I now know, having done this for 2 years? So the first thing is get central support within your university. Now, I know that people on the call work in different parts of your universities. If you work in a faculty or a department, what you really need is the equivalent of like your planning office or your central people that hold all of the key data within your university. That's absolutely key, because you need to return data on university level information. So that's really important to get that support, get them to help you, because you've got to give information like the overall number of students you have according to different disciplines, that sort of thing. So you need that good management information centrally. Also, if you work in a centre of a university, the opposite is true. You need to give lots of case studies, which will often be developed at departmental or faculty or school institute level. So you need good academic engagement as well to do this. It's not just a management exercise. It gets to the heart of your academic mission as well when you enter this, which is why it's such a good ranking. Get the human resource in place as well. And by this, I mean the people, not your HR department, although you might need to ask them some questions about your equality and diversity policies. What I mean by this is you need somebody to lead this project, to be the lead person, and you also need somebody to do a bit of the chasing. And in terms of, it'd be interesting to share some perspectives from people who have entered this. my experience is if you have somebody like me or equivalent that can sort of chair a group or be ultimately responsible as the most senior person in the university and can click go, and you need somebody like that that has that seniority and clout to make sure that you can chase people for various information and they will reply because they recognize this is important. So you need a senior sponsor. In my university, that's me. You also need somebody to do that chasing as well and pulling the information together. It's like a bit of a jigsaw puzzle that you have to put together. It's not too complicated, I don't think, but the pieces are scattered around. So you do need somebody to find all those pieces and the edges and put it together and think about the bigger picture. So we've operated in Manchester with using a very recent graduate of the university, somebody who's interested in the SDGs and perhaps studied some of them as an undergraduate, and a recent graduate can really help do some of this work with you. So I think having a senior sponsor and somebody who is just very bright and can be quite organized and methodical about what they do and chase people and realize what's important and what's relevant, make some of those judgments. Between you should have enough resource. And the window, it's a couple of months this year. It may be extended, Duncan said, so maybe think of it between about an 8 and 12 week period where you do have somebody in place. I'd say you need them in place for probably at least a month, somebody of that kind of level, pulling that information together. So do plan that. And if you don't have that support, make sure you do ask for that, because that will mean it's a bit more straightforward for you to enter. Now that means, when I say you need somebody full-time for a month, we enter all 17 and we take it seriously as well. But we enter all 17. So if you're not going to enter all 17, you probably don't need anything like that amount. That's just us being very thorough at Manchester. Be systematic as well. So there's a really nice online form, which the Times Higher give you, but really most of the preparation we do is in an offline version of this so that you can see this. So whichever system you create, you need a system in place, because there is so much information from different parts of the university. So it's very likely that you'll have a preferred way of working, whether it's a Google Sheet or Excel or whatever it might be. You'll probably need something like that to keep on top of the project. Be bold, I'd encourage you. Enter as many as possible. Now that doesn't mean, don't be put off if you can't enter all of them. Very few universities did, I think, and Duncan will tell you how many entered all 17. I bet you it's very few, and we were one of them. And I think that's unusual. But even if you feel like you're not going to do so well, I still think it's worth entering those SDGs if you've got the information and it's available, because it gives you an indication, it gives you something to aim for, it gives you good information. And some of them, if you're not going to do as well in them, actually maybe you'll never do as well because that's not the mission of your university. And that's interesting to know as well. It shows the mission relevance of what you're doing. Duncan gave a great example earlier of water. The weather isn't always like this in Manchester. It's normally a bit more cloudy. So yes, we don't suffer with issues around water. So we do some research in this. We have an amazing research global project actually on dams at Manchester, which is absolutely about water. But generally compared to some universities, for example, in the Middle East, where water is in a shorter supply, that would, you wouldn't expect us to do as well. So that's good to know as well. And we will still enter that SDG on water, but we wouldn't expect to do as well as some other universities perhaps. But be bold, enter as many as you can. Be humble as well, and that relates to my last point. In these SDGs, you can see that both the type of university you have and the type of country that you reside in will affect your ranking. So type of university, so inevitably some universities like mine in the UK, we have a system where it's very similar to many other countries where your exam grades determine whether you can get into the university. And we know that in all unequal countries in the world, if you're from a more privileged background, you will get higher grades and you'll get into a more prestigious university. So can we expect to recruit as many students from disadvantaged backgrounds as a university with much lower entry requirements? No, I don't think we ever will. And it's just reflecting, understanding that it's not about doing well in these indicators, it's also understanding your own institution and some of the structural barriers and constraints we all operate in, because we work in different types of universities. You can have some universities that really specialize just in medical and health programs, and you'd expect them to do really well on SDG 3. So be humble. You can't be expected to do well in all of them. That's not the point of this, to do great across all 17. It's absolutely not the goal. So recognize that you will do well in some areas more than others, and that's to do with the type of university you work in. And then the type of country. Duncan mentioned, I thought it was a great example about water. I think in countries like Britain and America, we have more inequality. So you'd expect some challenges around some of those SDGs around issues of equality. And some countries have a more even spread, and more people from, there's less people from disadvantaged backgrounds more generally, but they might be more likely and more expected to go to university where there's less inequality. So it will reflect the type of national system you have as well. I think some of the global north countries have been doing things on gender equality in certain ways compared to other countries, and that will again will reflect some of the outcomes on that SDG. So it will reflect the type of country you have as well. So just be humble and don't think it's all to do with your own university and your own entry. It's not. It reflects other structural factors. And the last thing to say is make it useful. The only point in entering this is if it's useful for you. So for me, it gives you great information that you wouldn't otherwise have. For us, we wanted to know how well do we meet these big goals in the world as a university. So that's the main reason why we wanted to understand not just where do we fit into that compared to other universities, but also then how can we use this information to do forward planning? How can we use this to think about things that we should be doing that we're not at the moment? How can we use this to make sure that we continue to do some of the great work that we've invested in at a time when, let's face it, among universities around the world, we're all going to be entering more difficult times financially and in terms of our missions because of our response to the pandemic. So it might be something that you're really good at the moment and you want to ensure you retain being good at that. So whatever it might be for you, make it useful as well. Use the information you get and use it to advance what I think is a mission that all of us would agree with about our universities being relevant to the big questions in the world. So there's my 7 top tips. What I'm going to do now is unshare my screen and hand back to Valmor, who's going to now chair a bit of a discussion, I think, on this. Is that correct, Valmor?
Thank you very much, Julian, for the very nice presentation and for sharing the experiences of your university with us. We are going to start the Q&A session for all attendees. You can either type your question in the question and answer box, or you can click the raise hand button and we will be able, I hope, to see your request, and then you can speak out your question for our guests. We have already 4 questions. Just let me see here. Oops, sorry. Yeah, the first one is, is it possible to update the information after completing every SDG line? And also, is there a limit of descriptions and uploading materials?
So the way the portal works, the data submission portal works, is that essentially it's an online form, and you put information into it. You can save progress as you go, but the data isn't sent through to Times Higher Education until you get to the end and you press a button that says submit. And that's designed to allow you to go in and put in the first version, change that data if you need to at a later stage. So until you press that submit button, it isn't submitted. It also means, by the way, that you can enter this process and you could get to the end and decide, actually, we don't think we're ready this year to submit, so we won't go ahead. There's no expectation that just starting the process forces you to actually press that end button. And Julian, you know, your experience of that might also shed light on that. In terms of limit of descriptions and uploaded materials, yes, when it comes to the evidence, we explicitly say we don't expect you to provide every single example of something you're doing. And a great example of that would be in Sdg 5 when we look at gender equality. One of the things we ask is, do you provide ongoing support for women in the university? Now, clearly that might be devolved down to faculties or to schools. We don't require you to produce evidence for every single part of your university about exactly how they're doing it. What we ask is for you to provide a single example which showcases the type of thing you're doing. So we do allow you to have multiple pieces of evidence for circumstances where the question we've asked is answered across multiple documents, but we don't expect that to be the norm.
Okay, thank you. I have another one. Since the evidence is usually our website and websites are always being updated, is it okay if the website information reflects a more recent year than the year the ranking is measuring?
Broadly speaking, yes. So we typically officially talk about the last full academic year as being the year we're looking at. But if you provided evidence that had been updated since then, normally we'd be okay with it. I think there are a couple of exceptions. So for example, when we ask you about did you produce a sustainability report, we'd expect that report to be published in the relevant year. But those are the kind of things that tend not to be updated on website. As we saw from Julian's brilliant 6,000 download document, those are the things that tend to persist. But yes, we expect there to be some flexibility there, and we will be genuinely open to that. Again, as always, please do talk to us about that if you have concerns. And then we have a team of people whose job is simply to answer these questions as you go along. So if you have explicit concerns, please do get in touch with us.
Okay, another one. Since a lot of work has changed since COVID, and COVID hit after the 2019 year, can actions taken to address COVID count toward this year's rankings?
They could, but I'd prefer to look at stuff that was relevant to the year in question. I think there's no doubt that universities do some fantastic work around COVID, but if possible, try and relate documents to the year we're asking about. You will have plenty of opportunities to demonstrate the brilliant work you're doing around COVID later on. I do think there is, by the way, this isn't directly answering the question, but I think it's worth saying. I think there is a strong link between the universities who are have demonstrated in the past good practice in terms of their impact, particularly around Sdg 3, for example, and those who have been best placed to work on issues around COVID. The other Sdg I'd pull out for that, not oddly, but from a very different perspective, would be Sdg 8, decent work and economic growth. There's no doubt that COVID is not just a health crisis, it's also a financial crisis, and how universities are situated to behave in terms of being good employers in this point of time is really, really important.
I think on that, Duncan, just to come back around the COVID question, because it's a really good question. I guess the year in question for this ranking is the 1920 academic year, isn't it?
Yes, it is.
So obviously the pandemic for most globally, lockdowns began anything from in China from sort of January, February time right through to April time, but most of the world was in some type of lockdown before the last academic year ended, if you follow a similar cycle to what we do, which roughly most of the world does. So I guess there were some things that we did in that cycle, which I think would be good examples in some instances where they're more case studies. I guess Duncan's point about some of the data though on numbers of students and numbers of tons of this or a percent of women, that's not affected by COVID so much. But I would expect both this year and next year, and definitely it becomes, and I'd imagine if you're going to have examples, it'd be more likely to be in Sdg 3 if you did some specific things this year. But Duncan's absolutely right. I mean, the whole, what is a global health crisis will quickly become a global social and economic crisis, and the opportunities to build back greener and green recovery from this and to reset the world in terms of how we build back. So I think that's going to, those examples I think will be stronger next year. Duncan's right, but there will be things I'm not sure what they are in my university's case yet because we've not started our process yet, but there will be some, I think, particularly on health that all of us did, which because of the timing, it just about met that.
Yeah, and I think there's an interesting sort of follow-up to that, which is there are a couple of questions we're going to have to look at quite carefully for, not for this year's process, but for next year's process. One of the ones which obviously stands out to me is back in SDG 8, where we ask about the proportion of employees on short-term contracts. And the idea there was to reward universities who offer people long-term contracts so that people have more security in employment. The danger, of course, is that when universities have been under financial pressure, they may have found it easier to reduce jobs for people with short-term contracts. And what I don't want to end up is in a situation where we effectively end up rewarding universities who have fired people because they were on short-term contracts. So we're going to have to explore some of this, I think, quite carefully looking ahead to make sure that we aren't generating any unintended consequences there.
Okay, thank you. Faisal wants to ask you a question. Please, Faisal, go ahead. I guess his microphone is off.
Faisal, you're on mute.
Yeah, yes. Hi. First of all, I want to thank the presenters about very important presentation. I want to ask, in the past, when we talk about ranking the academia or the universities, we don't mention many the indicator of social responsibility. I mean, from academia to the neighborhood to the society. Do we see this phenomenon become more and more that have more weight in the ranking of the universities around the world?
Do you mean, Faisal? Thanks, and hello, Faisal. I hope you're well. Nice to hear your voice. Do you mean in the overall rankings outside of this table or within this table?
I'm talking about usually when you talk about universities around the world, the issue of social responsibility wasn't in the past one of the major issues.
Okay.
And I see in the last 10 years, more and more we are become aware of the importance of social responsibility from the academia to the society. I want to see if we are going to see that it will become more part of the ranking in the future as very important.
Today's seminar, Faisal, is a great example of what you're talking about, the fact that the Times Higher have recognized this as a major force in the world, let's face it, in these rankings, and a big part of what all universities are engaged with in terms of different indicators. It's going to be one of the main indicators any university is looking at. So the fact that the Times Higher came forward and felt that this was an important trend happening in higher education, they didn't invent this trend, the Times Higher, they're reflecting it, of course. And so why is that? And I think, as you'll know, Faisal, there's a movement around the world for universities to capture in their missions more what they're delivering to society, and rather than be these ivory towers, which it looks like in my, these separate places, which exist separately to the cities in which they're inhabited, to be much more part of their communities. This reflects, I think, a growing trend around the world of universities seeing themselves much more as part of civil society. And I think as we face more challenges in the world, the need for universities becomes more apparent. And I think the pandemic lays that bare clearly. If we're going to find our way out of this, you need science, you need research, you need treatments, you need vaccines. If we're going to build back better, you need innovation and productivity and really imaginative strategies on growth and inclusion and work and employment. So we know that this is something that's really important. What's also we've all seen, I think, is a real trend coming from our client base, if you like, as universities, from the young people and our students. And you've seen that in terms of global movements of young people who now, when they're thinking about university, will be also thinking, I want to use my education to try and improve the world I live in if I'm going to be a leader of tomorrow. But B, if I've got a choice of different universities I can go to, and I want to go to a university that takes these issues seriously. So I think we're seeing a big trend, and I think this ranking, it won't perfectly measure everything there, but what it does is it really reflects that what the Times Higher did. And I think there's other people who are trying to do similar things. And in a national context in the UK, we've got what we call 3 F-in frameworks now in the UK. We have a REF, TEF, and a KEF. So the REF is the Research Excellence Framework. And that measures the impact of our research on big societal challenges. We've got the TEF, the Teaching Excellence Framework, and that's starting to try and think about learning gain and other contributions that students can make outside of their core disciplines. And also, do they go on to graduate level employment, and do we really add value to those students when they're at university? And then we've got this new thing this year, which we're just doing at the moment, called the KEF, the Knowledge Exchange Framework, or Knowledge Excellence Framework. And that is looking at how we share knowledge with other people in society. So again, that's trying to get at this broader trend that you talk about, Faisal. But I don't know what you think, Duncan, about you reflecting this broader trend.
Yeah, so I think there are 2 things to be said. Firstly, I believe that universities have been doing some brilliant work around sustainability for a long time. Often, though, it's not really been surfaced in a coherent way. So you'll have individual groups within the university who are doing their own thing and doing really good stuff, but it's not always, centralized. It's not always visible. I think there are some, as Julian said, that there are some winds of change, as it were, sweeping through the world. One of which is that universities are going to be under increased financial pressure. And I think that for some universities, there has been a drift away from that core rationale of serving the community. A good example of this would be the land-grant universities in the United States, which were directly set up to support their states. But some of them have become more focused on the research and less focused on that sense of grounding in their community. And that's crucially important. And I'll go into a brief anecdote. This is something I heard from the Japanese education minister a number of years ago, but it highlights the dangerous position that universities are in. He was talking about when he goes into budget meetings and argues for money for universities. Because the first thing he heard is, and it was always the same, was that that's great, but only 11% of families in Japan have a direct interaction with universities, whereas 95% of families in Japan have a direct interaction with pensions. So that I think is the kind of thing we're going to be facing. If universities insist on standing alone as research institutions without that link to the community, it's hard to argue for the funding. If universities demonstrate the brilliant work that they are doing in terms of supporting wider society, then they're in a much, much stronger position. And final thing I'll say on this is that I have noticed in the last, I would say, 18 months to 2 years, there has been a marked change in universities. We're starting to see universities like Manchester, like Arizona State University, who are putting the SDGs themselves very much at the heart of how they describe their process. Carnegie Mellon University, for example, just did a voluntary university review. London South Bank University here, which is a very different university to Manchester. It's always been much more based around serving its local community. But that again is reframing their strategy in terms of the Sustainable Development Goals. And this, I think, is quite a significant change in how centrally important sustainability has become to the higher education sector.
Thank you.
Okay, now we have a question from Kristen. In what cases are you looking for descriptions in the caveats notes sections?
So usually those descriptions are simply to help us understand. Now, one of the good examples, I don't know whether there's anyone on the call from a Spanish university, but Spanish universities often put all of their policies into a single document, which has many hundreds of pages. And so when we ask for the policy on gender pay equity, it's really helpful if it's in a 300-page document that you tell us which page it's on. We will find it eventually, but it will take us a long time otherwise. Sometimes it's just about being clearer about how what you are providing as evidence relates to the question. And sometimes that is, again, about helping us to understand the local context. Now, as I said, we bring in experts who speak multiple languages, but they won't always understand the political, the cultural situation where your university is situated. So sometimes a little bit of extra description about how this links towards the SDG in the question can be very helpful to help us understand the evidence you've submitted.
Good. Now we have a question from Fernando. Julian, how did you guys manage to, how did you guys manage to achieve such a wide agreement consensus to move things this way?
And then he's got a follow-up underneath. He says, what I mean is, are people critical to both SDGs and SDGs and the rankings in general? So just to say again, hi Fernando, I hope you're keeping well. So that's a really good question. I think SDGs, I think there's a philosophical question in universities first of all, and some of this reflects perhaps views that I don't personally agree with, which is that you know, should we be trying to frame things in terms of SDGs? Should we let that tail wag the dog of a university? No, I don't think you should. But it doesn't mean the SDGs are not relevant. I think rather than see it as the SDGs being something that you have to totally pivot to and change everything you do, hopefully as a minimum, as a starting point, what it can do is give meaning to what you already do and set what you do into a more global context that's more understood by people. So if you're a university that's doing really interesting work on, I don't know, sustainable cities, you know, you have a big urban institute or a cities focus in your university, you can look at the SDG on sustainable cities and communities and think what are the big issues that the world is trying to address in terms of urbanization and cities. So it can provide meaning to what you already do as a minimum. But I think there are some people in universities that think, well, no, we have these research institutes. We're not going to change everything just because of the SDGs. And the SDGs are something external. We've got our own strategy. I can absolutely guarantee you that you can fit what you're already doing to many of the SDGs as a starting point. But hopefully what they'll do is give you a type of language, a way of communicating and reaching out to wider society that you don't currently have. Because I think we're terrible at using esoteric language and acronyms and talking to ourselves in universities. So actually, some of the bits we had to do in Manchester, first of all, is convince people that the SDGs were important. And when you can put money to this as well and think about funding opportunities, particularly for researchers that are always after new grants, there are lots of sources of funding around the world. And indeed in Britain, we're really lucky. And this is where I'm very proud of what my government has done, our Research Council, in linking research to our global development budget. So we have something called the Global Challenges Research Fund in the UK, which I think is probably the most advanced research program in the world connected to the SDGs. And there's lots of really good thinking. And to get that money, you have to understand the SDGs, the global challenges, and you also have to have this research co-produced with global partners, which I think is really important. And that really stops us thinking that arrogant attitude perhaps of universities are the only holders of knowledge. That creates amazing research by doing it in partnership with other communities. So I think what you have to do, Fernando, I think is rather than, you've got to try and frame it like in all things in universities. The first question I can see lots of my colleagues thinking, what's in it for me? And you have to speak in terms that your researchers understand, your students understand, your stakeholders understand. So I think there are lots of things in it for people in universities to engage in these SDGs. Whether it's your communications department, whether it's your catering department, right through to your professor of occupational therapy or environmental science, they will find things in there that are useful to them. And then you mentioned about rankings in general. Yes, you know, of course there are people in my own university very critical of rankings. I don't think they're a be all and end all. There are many, personally, I don't think you enter into rankings thinking that that's something that is the purpose of your university. It's not the purpose of your university. They're not an end in themselves, these rankings. They're a means to get into something. So if your means is that you have a particular mission that you're interested in and you want to understand that better, if the end you have in mind is to think, are we only good at these sorts of things that we think we're specializing in, we're investing money and time and energy in, it can be a means to that end. They're not an end in themselves. And I think it's typical on any pub day of rankings. We have lots of parody and spoof accounts on Twitter. There's one which turns the word rankings and it puts another letter towards the end of our alphabet in front of rankings. And you can find that on Twitter, and it's really funny. And it sort of says, and we have lots of parody accounts now in the UK where people will look at, you know, the university ranking. I saw the other day how close your campus is to the nearest Nando's, and you can rank every university in terms of how close it is to the nearest Nando's restaurant. You can do all sorts of things if you want to, and some of them obviously have more value than others. But for me, as long as you put them in their right place, you don't see them as an end in themselves. They can tell you something useful, and I think some of the measurements we have can cost a lot of money. And to me, another thing as well is this is free to enter, and I think that's something. Of course, the Times Higher, they have a commercial interest. Let's be honest, and they can sell you data back, and some people are cynical about that, and you can be if you want to. But we choose to enter this. We get lots of good information back for free. We enter into this because we get, there's no bars on entry, and from our point of view, we get good information back and it's useful to us in our planning. So you have to take that judgment. I mean, you should only enter, that was one of my 7 things, make it useful. If you can't make it useful, then there's no point doing it. But for us, it's one of the many things we find useful. So I hope that answers your question, Fernando, and I hope you're well as well.
Okay, I'm going to change a little bit the order of the questions just because Duncan mentioned something about language, and we have a question here in this line. What if some documents of evidence are not in English? Can we show them in our language? Does it reflect the score we wish to get?
Straightforward answer, yes. Provide the documents in your language. It's our job to make sure we can interpret those. We bring in people with a wide range of language skills to enable us to do that. So you won't lose points for submitting in your local language.
That's good to know. If we were not speaking English, it's for us Portuguese from Brazil, not Portuguese from Portugal. And it is good to know.
We are well aware of that. We have a member of our team who is actually from Brazil, and this has been pointed for us on occasion.
Okay, thank you. Oh, I have another one here from Xenia. My question is for Duncan Ross. How do we give evidence of students ratio, for example, female students who are the first to graduate from the university, or any other similar ratio?
So in those cases, we simply ask you for the data. We ask you for the number of students and the number of female students, and we calculate the ratio from that. Now, how do we validate that data? Well, the first thing, again, is just to say that our starting point is we trust universities that they're not going to deliberately try to cheat. We do have other data that we can compare it with. Inevitably, because our definitions are slightly different than, for example, national definitions, we can't do a one-to-one comparison. But we will chase you up if we see numbers that seem to be implausible. So if you submit data and we see, for example, the total number of students you have seems to be implausibly large, we'll come back and we'll ask you for further information to validate that. But broadly speaking, for those situations, you give us the data directly. You don't necessarily have to provide evidence for that.
Okay, I believe I'm not forgetting any questions, but I do have a question for Julian, if I may. In our university, we have this, we can call indicators office. Then we are working towards rankings or services. And your university, the Manchester University, you are director for social responsibility. Could you briefly explain to us what is the true purpose of your office? Because it's, at least for me, for us in Brazil, it's kind of a novelty, this kind of office.
Yeah, I think it's an interesting strategy we've taken, because what it does, although we're quite a small office, we operate across the institution, and our role is to embed social responsibility across the rest of the university, because I think that's where, when you link it to your research and your teaching and your operations and your public engagement, that's where suddenly what can be seem like an impossible task becomes, you know, you've got 12,000 staff and 40,000 students and 300,000 alumni. Suddenly you have a really big team then. And that's the way you have to think about this agenda. And my office is there to develop the strategy, the indicators, to think about how we communicate and engage people on this, to think about our priority programs, and to think about what are the big external agendas that we need to link to. And increasingly our external agendas, we think about them in two ways. We think about our city region, because that civic agenda has become more and more important in the UK, and Duncan touched on that as well, how important that is. And that was something that the land grant universities were also, in the birth of universities in the UK, the civic institutions in their cities, they were set up to serve those cities, particularly during the Industrial Revolution, when there was an enormous amount of wealth in the UK for all sorts of spurious reasons, I might add. But we had lots of wealth very quickly in the UK, and most places established universities. So I think that city regional aspect, and then that global dimension through the SDGs, thinking about that local, that global. I think so what my office tries to do is to link to some of these big external agendas strategically as well, and to spot those opportunities. What that means though is that most universities don't have such an office. What you do need is somebody that sits centrally there, I think, to take an overview of this, because it doesn't, typically people think about SDGs. If you ask an academic member of staff, they'll think about their own research area. If you ask your teaching person, they'll think about the curriculum. If you ask a researcher, they'll think about your research strategy. What this this ranking does, but also what the SDGs do, is force you to think in this very horizontal way. The SDGs sit across as like a strata of rock across your whole institution. You cannot have a singular vertical view of the SDGs. And I think that typifies what my role is like in the university. It's always been this strata of rock, this horizontal agenda, which picks different things together. So I know in San Paulo, you know, you do amazing work on cultural engagement, you know, which is something similar as well. It sits across all of your different areas of the university. It's addressing lots of things. And I think that's something that increasingly you're seeing universities find the need to do, to join up those different aspects around external agendas. So I'd see that's part of what my role is to do, is to try and spot these external opportunities, develop strategies and put resource behind them, and measurements and investment. And you can't do everything as well, to set priorities about where you think you can make the biggest difference against whatever your mission is.
Thank you. Well, we have time for one more question from Robert Hollister. What information are you receiving about the impacts on applying universities of the process of applying? I was impressed with Duncan's comment about the value of public communication of the evidence provided by applicants.
So we've seen a number of different things, and I'm afraid as a data person, I'm sorry to admit that this is going to get a bit anecdotal. But we've seen a number of different things. Firstly, we have seen some universities who have taken the decision to use this as almost a stake in the ground. As Julian said, we may not be doing brilliantly at SDG 2, for example, but by making our evidence, making what we're doing more public, we are claiming that ground. We're saying this is something we think is important and we will work towards. Other universities are using this as a way, and this was always one of my not very hidden agendas. Other universities are using this as a way of bringing this data, which was already in the university, through the office of the president or the vice chancellor, taking it up to a higher level. One thing, you know, people have justifiably different views of rankings. One thing we do know is they get significant visibility from the leadership of universities. And what we also know about data is that when data goes through the senior officers of the university, it is more likely that the university will make strategic decisions based on it. If we can push the processes and the data around sustainability through the Vice Chancellor, through the President's office, you can guarantee it's going to be more likely that it's taken seriously than if it's in a standalone department that no one really talks to. And the other thing we've seen is that there is often a huge amount of interest in this. Some universities have used this as an opportunity to put out the call across the university for examples of work that people are doing. And when they've done that, what they've sometimes found is that they've got researchers clamoring to have what they're doing be the university's case study. So people are actually actively trying to get involved in this, trying to submit stuff because they want to showcase the work they're doing. And that is a really positive thing. It gets, it pulls together a spirit of that the whole university is working towards these goals. So I think it can be very positive if done in the right way. But again, to go back to what Julian said, absolutely, you need to know why your university wants to do this and what you hope to get out of it. And for some universities, this will not be the right way forward. Totally accept that. This has to be part of something the university wants and needs to do for it to be effective and for it to be useful.
Julian, would you like to comment?
I agree with all of that. So in the interest of time, I think we've got one more question just we can squeeze in. So I think I absolutely agree. It's got to be useful to your institution. It opens up conversations both with your most senior people in the university, plus with your academic colleagues as well, and indeed all of your everyday operations in the university. So there's a really good benefit from taking part about connecting you to one bigger picture of all these different things which previously have existed in lots of separate places in your institution. So there's something quite satisfying about solving that puzzle as well, given that these are the world's goals. You know, it's like, how does my university meet these big goals in the world? Here's one interpretation of that through entering the rankings. So I think there's something quite satisfying as an institution to have a coherent set of data against that.
Okay, we are really running out of time, but we have one more and last question, which is for Duncan. What is the reaction of the governments and intergovernmental agencies to your work on this, especially, say, education ministries or UNESCO or UNICEF?
So I've been working with the, I'm going to get lost in the alphabet soup of the United Nations here, with the United Nations Higher Education Sustainability Initiative, which is part of the high-level policy forum on sustainability. To try, well, firstly, I've been doing some work with them to try and ensure that any ranking that links to, or assessment that links to the Sustainable Development Goals does so in a responsible fashion. And I hope that we can continue that work, and we will continue developing the ranking to try and make it adhere more closely to those principles. There is evidence that governments are starting to take notice. Unfortunately, I can't say which governments necessarily, but we've been talking to a number of education ministries about the work we're doing. There's one national government that is looking to refocus all of their higher education sector towards the Sustainable Development Goals. That doesn't mean they're going to force universities to change what they're doing, but they're going to try and understand it in a very different framework. So I think that governments are starting to do this, and they shouldn't be a surprise to this, because every government in the world has signed up to the SDGs. Well, 196 governments have. I don't know if that's every government in the world. Vatican City, I'm not so certain. But almost every government in the world has signed up to these. If you can describe what your university is doing in terms that the government has agreed are important, then surely that is a great opportunity to talk to the government about the worth of your institutions.
Thank you. Well, we have a couple of minutes. If you, Duncan or Julian, for final remarks, it's up to you. I'm going to give you 30 seconds.
Just to say,
just kidding.
Our experience with everybody, and to kind of see some familiar faces in this. I don't think there's ever been a more important time to be demonstrating how universities are meeting these global challenges. So I think the SDGs, I think there are much, the pandemic is a microcosm for all the things in the SDGs about the interconnectedness of knowledge and and universities demonstrating their value to social health, environmental, economic progress. So I think all of the strange times we've been through in the past 7 or 8 months around the world, I think that need to connect our way into these external agendas has never been more important. So yes, there'll be more of a focus on, you might think it's all about SDG 3 now, but I think hopefully today's conversation and thinking about the kind of world we're going to be entering into in pretty much every country in the world, and certainly all going to be affected by some of the big changes in European and North American economies. At least we know there's going to be some challenges. So I think this agenda will become more important, I think, recognizing the role of research, the role of our students, the role of us as big employers in our cities, the role of us as having public intellectuals and engaging people in the big issues. So I think it remains, and it will until 2030, to be a really important framework for us. And this is one of the key ways in which universities can engage with it.
I don't think I've really got anything to add to that, Julian. Thank you so much for saying that. If any universities present want more details, please do email us on impact@timeshighereducation. But that's all I'm going to say.
Okay, then thank you very much, Julian and Duncan, for the excellent presentations. Very clear, a lot of information we have to reflect on. We really appreciate your time and effort to share your knowledge and experiences with us. I believe all this information is going to be really useful for our universities. Let's give a virtual round of applause for our guests. I don't have any comments or anything to say. I'm going to thanks all attendees for your time, your attention. Stay safe, stay healthy, and I hope I'll see you soon in person, maybe in Manchester. Have a good day. See you next time. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thanks.